This evening's speaker is Megan Rosenbloom, author of Dark Archives, a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin. Megan serves as librarian and co-founder for the Anthropodermic Book Project, for which she coordinates a multidisciplinary team of chemists, librarians, and museum professionals seeking to identify and scientifically test alleged books bound in human skin in the world's libraries and museums. As a former medical librarian, she was the founding president of the Southern California Society for the History of Medicine and still serves on their board. She is also a member of the Order of the Good Death, which focuses on building a meaningful, eco-friendly, and equitable end of life. In 2013, she co-founded and still serves as director for their Death Salon, a community that encourages conversations, scholarship, and art about mortality and mourning in the spirit of the 18th century salon. She currently serves as collection strategies librarian at UCLA Library, which, for those following along with the news, means that she is another Big Ten librarian. I hope you will join me in welcoming her this evening. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you. All right, volume still good, right? Okay, great. It's been so fun. I've been getting, the real Midwest hospitality. I got to do a marbling workshop today and a tour of the Center for the Book. It's just a really special place you have here, so I'm really delighted to be here in person. I've talked about my book a lot over the past couple of years that it's come out, but I've only had a few opportunities to speak about it in person because of pandemic, so it's really nice to see human faces, not in boxes. So thanks for coming out tonight. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the subject of my book, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. We're really talking about what is this whole human skin book thing? Where did it come from? Why is it relevant to the history of medicine? Why is it relevant to the history of the book? And then also, because this Bibliophiles group, we're going to get into, some interesting things about the physical book and the ways that we can interrogate historical books from a scientific perspective, and then also just some kind of fun, different, art books that have resulted from my book, because I thought it's fun to do a little show and tell at the end if we have time. So here's the big 50-cent phrase, which I mispronounced longer than I'd like to admit as the alleged main expert in this area. It's for the practice of binding books in human skin. It's anthropodermic bibliopegy. So if you got the anthro, human, dermic, skin, biblio, book, and the puji is the fastening, the binding of books in human skin. This image here is from Brown University's Hay Library. This is also the only image of a human skin book I have in my book. The reason why is because the rest of them, or most of them, look just like any other antiquarian book. So I didn't think it was that exciting to look at a lot of brown squares in the book. This one has a little bit more design pizzazz to it, with the gold, skulls and the onyx inlays and the little crossed knuckle bones and arrows and things like that. So that's why I showed this one. You will see some pictures of some others that aren't in my book today, but in general, these books really look like any other book on the shelf. You can't tell a human skin book from looking at it. And that actually makes them a little bit creepier, in my opinion. This sort of guy next door serial killer kind of thing, where it just looks normal, dark secret. Brown University's Hay Library has the second largest confirmed collection of human skin books in the world. And they actually have one of the most interestingly varied ones. So they had 5 alleged books and 4 were real. And the most books are at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia Mutter Museum at 5, confirmed. So why is this history of medicine So I was over at the Health Sciences Library today. We saw one of the Vesaliuses. Here's the human skin Vesalius. And it was bigger than I expected. Usually the human skin books are pretty small, but this one was pretty big. This is also at Brown. So, you know, Andreas Vesalius, father of modern anatomy. This collector, the collector who originally owned it, decided to bind one of his most valuable and favorite books from the history of medicine in human skin. Why would they do this, right? So the rumors about human skin books actually began at the same time that clinical medicine began, which was around the French Revolution. However, any of the books that we've tested from that era have turned out to be not real. But the rumors of this thing coincided at the same time. When did they actually start happening? It was through like the clinical medicine system. So before clinical medicine, you had a doctor who would work with certain families. They would, you know, cradle to grave kind of service, knew you really well, knew generations, etc. And if you had a doctor, and it wasn't just, you know, a local person helping out or a family member, then that was your relationship with your doctor. In clinical medicine, they set up rules around the education of doctors, that you had to learn science and you had to learn these things. And you would be practicing and learning in the clinic, which was, you know, usually run by churches, and they were sort of for the poor, and the doctors would go in and learn at the bedside of different people that they didn't know. And so you were seeing a lot more patients every day, but you also saw a lot more variety, and you learned a lot, and it made your practice better. So most of the things that came out of clinical medicine were good, right? You also learned at the cadaver, which was something that wasn't really available it wasn't, you know, dead bodies were not available. There was no donating of bodies to science. That wasn't a thing until the mid-20th century. So dead bodies weren't available, but then they were needed. And that led to a lot of interesting things like grave robbing and stuff by medical students you may have heard of. And so there was this now sudden familiarity with the dead body and dealing with corpses in a pretty, you know, unrefrigerated kind of gnarly way, right? But you're actually looking at dead bodies, and it's informing the way that living bodies work and how they're structured. Then you've got doctors seeing way more patients than they used to and not having a personal relationship with them. So they're getting more scientific, and then as tools and things develop, they're able to learn things about our bodies and how they work that is not from us telling them as patients, right? You're using these instruments where then the doctor is becoming sort of the expert of your body, regardless of whether you know what's going on. So obviously, this is an improvement in a lot of ways, except it also, at the same time, went along with this development of what Michel Foucault called the clinical gaze, which is like the way that doctors look at patients. And the way that doctors looked at patients was becoming more abstracted. And if you don't kind of check yourself with that, and you check in with your own humanity and take care of your own self and check in with the humanity of your patients, it can lead to depersonalization and burnout, right? And so what's the worst that can happen? This is the worst that can happen with that kind of view, right? Where the doctors were also they were becoming sort of gentlemen. They were moving up in the world in class, and they were encouraged by their leaders to start doing gentlemanly pursuits like collecting art, but especially books. There are still doctor book collector societies, right? It was very specific thing to doctoring that you were a learned person and that you loved books and that you would collect these rare books. And then when you were doing anatomical dissection, you had access to this most unusual of binding material that you would have thrown in the trash anyway. So why not save it and bind your favorite book in this thing? Now, if this was one weird Hannibal Lecter doctor that did this, you know, that's one thing. But there are dozens of these around the world, and there are a lot of different doctors, and some of them quite respected in their fields. So it's a really interesting sort of object lesson of all of these social things and historical things that are all kind of literally bound together in this object that we're learning about, right? And the other main thing is that only 10 years ago, we had the ability for the very first time to find out which ones were actually human and which ones might have had that rumor associated with it, but weren't for hundreds of years, right? So this was 19th century Western doctors, generally. You know, people tend to associate other things like Nazis and serial killers and stuff like that. None of that. 19th century, you know, America, UK, France, especially, coming out of this area. So here is the pesky little Harvard human skin book. Now, Harvard allegedly, so have any of you heard of this in the news in general? Okay, only one. So it's been in the news a lot, and especially lately. And I'm happy to like talk about some of the stuff about the news that's come out lately, you know, in the Q&A section. But long story short, there was allegedly 3 human skin books at Harvard. One in Houghton Library, one in the medical library, as you know, there's usually a doctor involved, so that makes sense, and one in the law library. And there was this chemist who was working with the Peabody Museum who was testing different, you know, museum artifacts. And their conservation lab at Harvard was like, hey, do you think this would work on human skin books? And he's like, well, let's try it. And it did. And that was the first human skin book test. 2 of those turned out not to be real, which people forget. But then there was one that was real. And the confirmation of this book kind of blew open the library world, because everyone who worked in libraries may have heard of a human skin book at so-and-so's collection, etc. Campus tour guides love to tell rumors about human skin books, whether they're true or not, you know, that kind of thing. But it was really kind of just a sort of untold secret, rumors, innuendo, until this point where, okay, no, there's definitely at least one that's real. And the reaction to it was like very strong, and it was a big PR issue for Harvard, and continues to be today. So this was sort of the one that launched the whole public kind of knowledge about human skin books. So I ended up teaming up with that chemist who did that first test because we were comparing notes about which ones we had heard about and, you know, what existed out there. I started doing some research into the literature about, you know, people mentioning, oh, well, we all know about this one, and a certain doctor has a blah, blah, blah. It was always very vague and whatever, but sometimes it was really easy to pick out specifics, like at this institution or whatever. And so I started gathering that stuff, and then we started reaching out to those institutions to see if they wanted to test and find out, and that was sort of how our project, our Anthropodermic Book Project, was born. This is the only time I've like physically done the test myself, because I'm a pretty klutzy person, and it's, you know, I was very nervous to do this. This was at the Huntington, which is near me in Los Angeles area, and they had an alleged human skin book that was medical in nature, and that turned out to be real. And then they had an alleged note on human skin that had implications where it was alleging, you know, Native Americans kidnapping people, and I'm writing on this piece of skin, et cetera, and that turned out to be fake. So then it calls into question a lot of things about that object, right, and the veracity of it. It's also kind of side note that anytime that we've encountered a book that mentions the race of a person, it's been, if we've tested it, it's been fake, which was a surprising find for me. I'm not saying that it's not possible that real human skin books were made from people of color, because when you make leather, it just can be any color. You can change it to any color. It's not like it doesn't show up the way that your skin shows up. So there's no way of looking at something and being like, oh, that was clearly from a, African American or something like that. And there's no way scientifically right now to find that out either. So that's one of the things we can't know. But anytime there's been an allegation and it's said it's from, a Native American or that one, it was saying it was a Native American that perpetrated it. But, it's from the skin of a Black person using old language, etc. Not real. So here I am holding my breath, trying to take the teeniest possible little sample off of this book. Now, technically, this test is destructive. And you'll hear this in library land. We don't do destructive testing. Certain institutions say absolutely no destructive testing. But, and I keep wondering if at some point this is going to stop being meaningful to people, like they won't know how big a penny is. I really think I need a better example. But, that little smudge above Abe's head, if it is bigger than that, basically, if you can see it with your human eye, the little piece of paper, the little piece of leather you take off the binding, it is big enough to test. So technically destructive, would someone notice it was gone off of the object? Probably not. So we take this tiny little piece, and you put it in a little tube, and you digest it. This is the science part. Digest it in an enzyme called trypsin, and you run it through a mass spectrometer, and then what you get is a peptide mass fingerprint. And it gives you this little graph, and this handy little graph will show you what a human skin protein markers look like, and sheep. Sheep is the most common imposter for human skin. It is ironically like the cheapest thing that you can find old books in, but it also has a tendency to look creepy. And because of that, people think this is human skin because it's got pores and hair and weird stains and things. People just kind of go there with that. But sheep is generally not. Now, so do we DNA test these books? No, we don't. Why? The leather tanning process is really chemically altering, and they're hundreds of years old. So any DNA that was in the book is usually reliably gone at that point, at least with current methods. There's advances in ancient DNA all the time. There's some really cool work being done, which I'll talk about later, but in general, your DNA is pretty toast at that point. But what is very persistent are your proteins. Your proteins can last thousands of years. You do all sorts of stuff to them, but they're less precise. We can learn less specific information about them. And so the collagen in your skin is what we're testing here, right? Now, animal families, I swear I'll get over the hard science stuff now, but I have to get it up. So the Bovidae family is most of your leather animals, right? Your sheep, cow, goats, deer, all in the same family. However, they differentiated far enough back in evolutionary time that there is one protein marker that is different among them, and that is how we can actually tell that's a sheep, that's a goat, that's a cow, which is very convenient for us. Didn't plan it that way, but thanks. The humans, we are too close in evolutionary time to the other members of the Omidae family. So if there was a book made from a chimp or a gorilla, it would look exactly the same as human. But usually there are a lot of context clues that point to human if we're testing. So it's probably not a gorilla. And I did say in the book, I was like, if anyone has heard of another one, please let me know. And I did actually encounter a chimp fur-bound origin of the species at one point. So, ask and you shall receive, I guess. We didn't test it or anything. I kind of take their word for it because it's covered in fur, right? But in general, it's probably human in that case. So, current figures, this changed recently. This was 50 forever. It was 50 for years. And now, some stuff has been happening. People have been getting in touch, and even though we're kind of on hiatus and have been since pandemic because we didn't have access to labs, et cetera, we're an independent research entity that kind of got together for this project. Our chemist is like a retired person who does it in his spare time for fun, so I would love to see this work get transferred to an institute of some kind. The actual testing is very easy. It's cheap. The lab equipment is cheap. It's very inexpensive. But I would love for there to be a place where people could go. That's an institution that would do this. But I don't know who's really willing to swing for that. Who's excited to jump into the human skin book testing game. It's maybe not the most popular PR choice, but it would be nice. We've tested 32 of these alleged books. Now, so when I say alleged books ID'd, this is in public collections and their books. So libraries, museums, etc. We have tested many private collection items. We have tested a number of weird things that aren't books. I mentioned that thing on skin. We've tested some other weird stuff too, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A if you're intrigued. But in general, that's the scope of the project that I'm listing here. We've tested 32 of them, which is not a bad ratio for being completely independent and just asking, right? There are certain ones at certain organizations, like I mentioned, no destructive testing, et cetera, we're never gonna be able to test. But, we've gotten a pretty good success rate there. And 18 of them have been confirmed as human, but 14 have been confirmed as not, which is also pretty high. For something that has been believed for hundreds of years to be human skin, that is written all over it, that's human skin, then you find out it's not human skin. So this is what's exciting to me, right? We have these books, we have this belief, unquestioned, understandably so, for hundreds of years, and suddenly we have a way of knowing. So what are those implications for history of the book? So this is the first alleged human skin book I held in my hand. It was a little bit of a surprise. I was in rare book school cataloging early in my career, and somehow the topic came up. And then, every day you would get a new book on your cradle to start cataloging. And so I picked mine up and I'm looking through it, and the professor was like, oh yeah, that was our human skin book that we have. And it was already in my hand. I was like, oh, okay. It was shocking way to first encounter one. Usually people don't encounter it for the first time already holding the thing. So this was one of those books from the French Revolution. The book itself is from before that, but it's a little prayer book. And then there's this very dramatic story written inside. It says, bound in human skin. And it's a matter of fact that during the horrors of the French Revolution, tanneries were established in various parts of France where the skins of the victims of the guillotine were tanned, and some were even used to make books on account of the fine grain. So they're also making claims that people made books out of them because the leather was good, which is a weird thing, but something I get asked a lot. No, human skin is not better than animal skin at making books. But yeah, and it was this is one of these books. So this is a very big assertion happening in this book. And then years later, my team tests it, and it's horse. So here we are with this object that is now telling us a falsehood, right? And someone wrote it in there for good reason. Mostly, with some exception, with one in particular exception, which was the Notre Dame book, I do not think that people wrote these in order to deceive. I think this was an honest belief. A rumor, whatever, someone wrote it in there at some point, people wrote it in there so they would remember, oh, that's the human skin one, or whatever, in the big collection. And then it just was taken for granted, because why would you question that if you saw it in there? That's a pretty surprising thing to lie about, right? But I think what these books do for history of the medicine, for history of the book, is that they're really highlighting underdocumented parts of the bookmaking process and also like stewardship of rare books, right? So you've got an author who writes the material of the text of the book. You've got illustrators, those are usually signed. Then you've got like printers, sometimes you know who the printer is. Sometimes you can hold up a page and see a watermark from a certain paper maker and you know that's where that came from. Sometimes binders, if they were famous, would sign their bindings, you know, so you may know who a book binder is. But do you ever know who the tanner is? Where they got the leather from? Almost never, right? And that's the biggest question mark in a lot of these stories for me. But when I started digging into each individual book, you just realize there's so many people involved in the creation of these books, and then they're owned by someone, the person who created them. Then maybe they get transferred to another owner or an institution, and then the institution is stewarding this, you know, object where people are having lots of different feelings about it over time, right? Having different reactions to it. So it just kind of highlights this thing that, you know, how complicated these handmade books that are all unique in a way, you know, what that's really like. And it also kind of highlights how important the physical object is. There are a few books, human skin books. The one that pops to mind is the Boston Athenaeum book, which is digitized, right? So you can look at the digital copy. I actually would recommend it because that was the only human skin book where the person wanted to be a human skin book, and he's telling the narrative of his life as a highway robber, and it's quite a ripping like story actually. So that is one you would maybe want to read, and it's pretty interesting, but is nothing compared to seeing it in person. And so these books are really like, you could read the text of this book, but you know, the important stuff is all the stuff around it, right? All the things about its physicality. And so that kind of leads me to where we learn about these books through provenance research, like traditional historical research about books, who own them, how they were made, etc. And then this combination also biocodicology. So biocodicology is such a new field that the first conferences for it, as far as I can tell, happened in like 2018 or 19, right? So there was this traditional discipline called codicology, which is like looking at the way books were put together to learn about the history of craft and how they were made and how things were made in different places and, you know, ornamentation on the bindings and the style of binding and the paper and all these things, right? The physicality of the book. Biocodicology is, what if we took advanced science methods and then interrogated those same hundreds of years old books? So biocodicology is happening on proteomic levels, like the Anthropodermic Book Project, but a lot of books and manuscripts are on parchment. So unlike leather, parchment is animal skin that's like scraped, and you can write on it, and it's less shelf stable, but a lot less has happened to it. So it retains a lot more of the biological data than something that's gone through the leather process. So on these parchment, you know, books, either the covers or the pages inside, you can learn about these objects on the genomic and even microbiomic levels. So I wrote this article at the bottom here for the Journal of the Medical Library Association. It's open access, so if you're curious about this kind of thing, I sort of rounded up some of the early works in this field. And it shows what some of folks have been doing and learning about these, about parchment things. So, you know, finding evidence of cattle, you know, disease on these York Gospels. I think my two favorites are the next two, where there was this New Zealand kind of founding document, and it was clearly damaged and put back together, right? And the damaged piece was a different color and looked like a lot different than the big, like the part that was put back onto the main piece look different, you could see the visible mend, right? So everyone kind of just assumed that that piece was a replacement, a newer replacement. But then they tested those two pieces and realized they were from the same piece. So they actually, it ended up that it was two different pieces. One piece must have been kept in different conditions than the other that made it look different, but it's actually, it was made whole, it wasn't a replacement. So that's very valuable kind of information to have. But the next one is sort of almost science fiction-y to me, where you've got these death registers from the plague era, and you've got evidence of the bacteria that causes the plague, potatoes, corn, carrots, chickpeas, human traces, mice traces. So it's like painting this picture of this monastery where they're sitting there writing all the people that died that week, and you're eating your lunch over the thing, and it's dropping all over the place, and the mice are coming in and eating up the books, which they sometimes did, that kind of thing. So it's really giving you a lot of information, and also that plague was there, right? So there's a lot of really cool, amazing things, work that can be done by scientists because we have these physical objects that we've stored and taken care of for hundreds of years. So here is a fun example, I think. This is at my institution at UCLA, where we had an alleged human skin book. And it comes from that era, that French Revolutionary kind of era. But it's just a book about like how things moved around the city of Messina. It wasn't religious, it wasn't anything like that. And then you've got the kind of creepy looking cover, right? But then inside there's all this information from all of these people telling you things about the book. So you've got that it was owned by James Westfall Thompson, and he was a UC Berkeley medieval historian with an interest in the French Revolution, so it makes sense why he would buy an alleged human skin book from the French Revolution. So he's got his little stamp at the top. You've got in a nice old handwriting, in French from the library of Monsieur Bignon, who was the librarian for Louis XV. So it's like coming from this French royal aristocratic background. And then you've got Relia un peu humaine, which is bound in human skin in French. And then you've got more notes about the history of it and where it comes from, etc. And then you've got this crime here, which I was talking about earlier today, where libraries did not always do the right things about the way we marked books. So this is like little holes chewed out of the paper that says University of California at Los Angeles Library. Somebody did this to a book from the 1600s. Hurts my feelings, but it's also evidence that we don't always know that we're making the right choices, right? We make mistakes for sure in our stewardship. You'll also see that at some point, it might be a little hard to see, it was put into a clamshell box for its protection, and it's got a little short title to let you know what it is, and then in parentheses it says human skin binding. It's because it's very likely that you would be pulling this out more often than other books, which can be very annoying for some librarians. If they don't like, oh, we have all of these amazing historical things and you want to see the human skin book, a lot of people resent it, I found, but that made it easier to find, right? And then when we tested it and it turned out to not be human, so many lies are happening on this object, right? And we've got notes in the catalog record about the testing that happened and what the results were. But if we had some sort of apocalypse and the whole catalog went down and you just stumbled upon the ruins of the library and came across this box, how would you know that it wasn't actually human? Everything about it is telling you that. So for those reasons, I actually think the fake books are just as interesting as the real ones, right? It offers so many questions, and I think it's a really good example of all the ways that we can keep learning about something from the past. So, we're talking about the physical object of the book. And when I wrote my own book, there was a lot of things that happened in the production of that book. It came out in October 2020. So there was a lot of things that if you wanted to know about the history of this book in the future, it's like 500 years later, that you wouldn't know because it's not written down anywhere, but a lot of choices went into the physical creation of the book, and a lot of different like manifestations, as we call them, happened. And I think it's just kind of interesting how you can also look at modern book production through the same kind of historical lens that we've developed looking at these old books, right? So my book was published, and it got, like, good news, got in a big book club. That was awesome. But the first printing, like, went out of print really quickly, and then they tried to make more, but there was no book production happening because it was like the beginning of the pandemic. So they said that it would be in the warehouse by October 31st, which is kind of my prime time here, you may have gathered. And it didn't get into the warehouse until January. So there was like a lot of interest in the book that was organic and was great. I was like really surprised, but no one could get it. So I accidentally published a rare book. And it sounds cooler than it is. So that first, like, hardcover book is actually, you can't get it. It's like, it doesn't exist. It's like very, if you got it on pre-order, like, this is why you got a pre-order, right? So that first hardcover book is like gone. Also, originally, the book was supposed to have the treatment that you see like on the right here, where it was the printing on the hardcover with the gold and the whole thing. It was going to be this really cool object, and I was so excited because it was like, that's what it should be. It should be like a beautiful object because this is about love of rare books and, the extremes people sometimes go for that. But, due to supply chain, blah, 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 all this stuff, had to change it and make it like a normal hardcover book, which I tried not to complain about, but like hurt a little bit, but it was okay. And then that book doesn't exist really hardly at all, so it was fine. But then, I've gotten a few foreign translations here, and every foreign translation, they make a different cover, they do different things, and so it's so fun. These things just show up. I have no say of it at all. In the Polish one, my author photo is the same, except it's like really high contrast, so I look like a Victorian ghost. It's like very, very goth. The French one, they just put all these interesting little, like, skulls and things on it. And then, weirdly, the Russian one, during a war, which I didn't think was, like, they optioned it, and then I thought, oh, this is never going to come out, just shows up looking like the original one was supposed to. Like, they, like, spent money on this, and I was like, this is weird, right? So it's just, like, this interesting, weird kind of ways that the same title has come out in modern world in, like, interesting ways. But even better is that I was at a book fair, and I met, while the book was still, like, in production, and I met a rare bookseller who works a lot with art bookbinders. And he said, hey, if you can get your book in the boards, like, just the text block, if you could get some of those from your publisher, I have this idea. And I'm like, yeah, right, whatever, right? It's just like people, I just didn't expect it to go anywhere. But this guy really followed through. And so what ended up happening was 6 art bookbinders took my book and then created, like, art bookbindings. Like, they have, it's like the coolest thing that's ever happened to me. They took these things, they read the book, and they had their own interpretations of what it meant and what was important about it, and they all did these things. So that's why Bibliophiles, I'm about to, like, do a little show and tell of these because I think they're really fun. So what did we do with these books? They were all, I think there's one that's still available for sale. But they were all sold to, one was a private collection, others were institutions, and they were used to fund a BIPOC scholarship for the Guild of Bookworkers. So it's like, helping people come, like, people who are usually not represented in bookwork, being able to, like, come and learn about bookcraft, and I think that's super cool. And it was just, like, a really fun project. But each of these binders did like completely different things. Now, I have a little link there. I don't know if these are going to end up available anywhere, but there's a whole online exhibit where you can see lots of pictures of each of them and the artist statements, which are like the best part because people really were thoughtful about it. So this is one where he was kind of doing the idea of, you know, there's this creepy, dark thing inside a very normal looking box, you know. The pictures don't really do this one justice. It's like very weird looking in person. It almost looks like it's not stable, like it looks different when you hold it. And it's got really interesting end papers that look like the moon, but it's actually like magnified skin and stuff like that. This is the one that's still available. This one is Samuel Feinstein, who's like unbelievable binder. It is on pigskin, which a lot of people, you know, it kind of looks like human skin. Pigskin books do. Like the pores on them sort of are reminiscent. So that's why he picked that, because there's these like really prominent pores. And he created like 3 bookbinding tools like from scratch to make this book. And it's really like the gold open ones are supposed to be human skin, like a human skin hide, representing the 18 that were proven to be real. It's just unbelievable. And then the other ones are like closed books, you know, stuff like that. It's just so cool. And you can see that all of these were done with like such intention, and they're all so different from one another. This one's fun. So this one came in an interesting way. This was not through the bookseller, but Mary Roach. Does anyone a Mary Roach fan? The writer who wrote Stiff and a bunch of other great books. So Mary blurbed my book, and I was like really happy for that. And she said, I just want you to sign a copy of your book so I can send it to my cousin in England who's a bookbinder. I was like, yeah, sure. And then he heard about the project. He like got wind of the project. He's like, oh, I want in. So he created this sort of puzzle box kind of CSI, you know, book. And the parts of it, when you shut off the lights, glow in the dark and say dark archives. There's like all these weird things about it. They're like bloody fingerprints on the edges and stuff like that. It's really pretty neat. This one is really cool, where it's got this sort of gate, which is made of animal bone. And it's really trying to highlight the inherent violence of making things out of animals, right? That's like where she took that, because all of those like antiquarian books are made from animals, right? This one's crazy because Gabby learned how to tattoo in order to make this book. So she got a goatskin hide, learned how to tattoo. So this is, as far as I know, the only place where my name is tattooed on anyone. It was really shocking to me. And since then, she's like gotten really into tattooing bindings. So now she's like taken that experiment and going off on this thing. So that's at the Free Library of Philadelphia, which is where I'm from. So that's like cool that it's there. And this one is the one at UCLA. And to me, this is like the most relevant one for our talk today, right? Because what Erin did, so we've got these hand, you know, marbled papers, and she used embroidery, and it's on like blackberry goatskin, she called it. And then she's got embroidered names of various women who were used, whose bodies were used by the medical profession, right? Where there were advances made, but humanity and like what we would now call consent and things that didn't really exist as a concept back then, where looking back, we're like, it was horrible that happened, right? Including the name of Mary Lynch. And Mary Lynch was 3 of the books at the Mutter Museum College of Physicians. That's Mary Lynch. But you may see some other names like Henrietta Lacks that you may have heard of, right? So she's taking inspiration from across the history of medicine. Like, we make advances, but don't forget, sometimes people are victimized in the process, and we need to like surface that and reckon with that as well. So that's the end of my formal lecture here, and then I'm just happy to answer any questions anyone has.